Welcome to the next installment in my video lecture series, and this is for managerial economics, and in particular we're going to be looking at Chapter 2, Supply and Demand, and we're going to be looking at Section 2.1 and Section 2.2, Demand and Supply. In particular, we're going to be taking a look at the graphic representation of, particularly what we're going to do is derive a market demand/supply curve from individual demand/supply curves. So realize that what we're going to do is take a look at, for example, what we have up here right now is we have individual demand curves, and we want to show how to get the market demand curve from these individual demand curves, and doing the same thing for the supply curves. Now I'm going to draw in a couple of things here just to illustrate a point. I'm going to draw a straight line here. And on top of that, I am going to put a point. So you can see here as I move this line, you can see I'm moving along demand curve 1. And what I'm trying to illustrate to you from this is if we want to take a look at what the market demand curve is, it's the summation of demand curve 1 and demand curve 2, but you have to realize that it's not always going to be a function of both of those items. If you take a look, for example, at any price below 50, the only demand curve that's operational or is going to be part of the market demand curve is demand curve 1. Once we get to 50, you're going to see that now we're going to be incorporating demand curve 2. But for any price above 50, the only demand curve that's pertinent to deriving the market demand curve is going to be D1. So what that tells me is that as I draw this downward, D1, this section up in here, is going to be the market demand curve until we get to the price of 50, and once we get to the price of 50 below, we're going to be adding demand curve 1 and demand curve 2 together in order to get the market demand curve. So make sure you're comfortable with that. And what I always tell students to do in this scenario, if you're asked to, if you're given graphically two demand curves, how do I come up with the market demand curve, is start at the highest demand curve and work your way down. And then once you hit another demand curve, that's where you're going to add that second demand curve in. So let me delete these two out here, that line and that point. So I know that D1 is going to be the operational portion of the demand curve from here to there. And let me change that so I can distinguish that for you. Let me make it like that. So you can see here that that portion of the demand curve, D1, is the market demand curve for prices above 50. Once we get to prices of 50 and below, we are going to add D2 into D1. And the way that you can do that is you're going to start from this point right here. And then all you need to do is add the quantities demanded for D1 and D2 at a price of 0. So at a price of 0, quantity demanded for D2 is equal to 500. Let me actually highlight that for you. So at a price of 0, the quantity demanded for D1 is equal to 500. And at a price of 0, the quantity, if we go along the demand curve, for D1, the quantity demanded is also 500. So if I add D1 and D2 together for a price of 0, I am going to get 1,000. So what I can do is just go to the point where the kink is going to occur for the market demand curve and draw it out to that point right there. So this is now the market demand curve. So if I highlight and hang those two together, the reason being is above a price of 50, D1 is the market demand curve for this particular marketplace, because at a price above 50, nobody that's incorporated in D2 is willing to purchase that item. So the operational part of the market demand curve is going to be D1 for prices above 50. Now to determine the lower section, now we are going to add D1 and D2 together. And to show that graphically, the easiest way to do it is just to select the point where price is equal to 0 and add the quantities demanded for D1 and D2. For D2, it's equal to 500, and for D1, it's also equal to 500. So at a price of 0, quantity demanded for D2 is 500. The quantity demanded for D1 is 500. I add those together, and that gives me the 1,000, and that allows me to draw that last section of the market demand curve in place. So this would be labeled DM for market. And let me move that so it can be more easily seen. And let me I'll change the font and give a little distance there so it's easier to see. And let me rotate it in a little bit. All right, so that's how you determine what a market demand curve it looks graphically when you're giving graphic representation of two different demand curves. We can do the same exact thing for individual supply and market supply. So we're just going to add these two supply curves together. So we have S1 and we have S2. And if we add those together, and for this it's a little easier because we'll just move from the bottom and they both intersect at the origin. So at a price of 0, S1 quantity supplied, little mistake here made here. Guess you could tell that I was copying and pasting these things and did a very poor job of doing it. So let's do that again. I fixed that. So here's our supply curve S1. So at a price of 0, quantity supplied for S1 is equal to 0. And if we look at S2, at a price of 0, quantity supplied is also equal to 0. So we know that our market demand curve, adding these two together, is also going to start at the origin. So we can start at the origin, but where do we want to end up with? We add up horizontally. So at this price of 50, quantity supplied for S1 is 200, while the quantity supplied for S2 is 400. So we have 200 plus 400. So at a price of 50, we are going to be at 600 and go to the origin. So let me draw that in for you. And let me label it. So we have supply market. We'll make it subscript. And we'll make the font bigger so it's easier to see. So this is the market supply curve. We just added S1 and S2 together, and the way we got the points were, we can see here that they both intersect at the origin, so the market supply curve is going to be it's going to start at the origin. And then we just pick a price of 50, which is the extreme end for these two supply curves as I've drawn them. So at a price of 50, I know that quantity supplied is going to be equal to 200. If I look at S2 at 50, quantity supplied is going to be equal to 400. So at a price of 50, it's going to be 200 plus 400, which is going to give us that 600. So I'm hoping that this helped you. This was a question that students had a bit of difficulty with the last time I taught the course, and I thought it would be a little bit helpful to give a video application of this to help students out who might be struggling with this for this particular iteration of the class.